So once it actually starts, which it hasn't actually started yet, it's just put it in a queue. You'll see that it actually gives you a job status at the bottom. So it says that this first mesh, it's actually still, the little spinny wheel's still going, so it's working. Once it gets somewhat far into the process, you'll see that a meshing log will appear that tells you what it's doing, basically, or where it is in the process of creating your mesh. Now, this mesh, in my opinion, is going to generate much faster than its estimate. I might not even get access to the meshing log before it finishes. That appears to be the case. I don't actually see anything. So it's 95% of the way done right now, which usually means it's actually, it's finishing up. So it finished in about a minute, let's say. Okay, so it took about a minute. I paused the video for just a couple seconds to see how it did. It took about a minute to create the video, or to create the mesh. Let me see here. It looks like it didn't listen to some of the things I asked it to do. And I see a warning log as well. Let's see what that is. It says the mesh size is smaller than the CAD entity tolerance or the small feature suppression tolerance for a bunch of different faces. The mesh may be coarser than desired. So it's trying to give me a warning. Let me see if I can parse out what exactly that means. What did it do here? See, it did exactly the thing that I told it not to do. Well, no, it didn't exactly do the thing I told it to do. So what it did here, so if you remember, there was like a little lip here that I wanted it to not try to model, and it didn't. It actually cut this one off, but because this geometric feature was bigger than the 100 microns, it actually tried to put some mesh elements in that little space there. And I allowed it to do that. That's okay. It created, so I remember that I asked it, so for thin features, I asked it to have 2 mesh elements across. That was my gap, my so-called gap factor. So 2 elements across, and that's pretty much what it did. It does not look like it listened to me very carefully when it created the features here. These are also only 2 elements across, but if I'm not mistaken, oh, I know what happened here. I accidentally typed in a maximum edge length of 0.7 meters instead of 0.7 millimeters. So it created a mesh that, basically that's such a long distance that it just ignored it. Okay, whatever. I'm going to use this mesh for now. That's okay. And probably even these bottom features will be okay. So let me call that my coarse mesh. So what I mean by that is it used a fineness level of 5. So we might want to go back and investigate different meshes later. But so now we have a mesh. Actually, this mesh is probably not too bad. I think it's going to get a pretty good solution here. But we won't know that until we do a mesh independent study. Okay. Let us run a simulation then. If you want to check it out when you're done, there is a meshing log down here. That'll tell you some statistics about the various elements that it generated. In particular, like you're looking for elements that are roughly so ideally the aspect ratio of things is about an aspect ratio of 1. And in fact, the median is an aspect ratio of 1. Anyway, whatever. There's a whole bunch of different things about like the statistics about whether the tetrahedrons that it generated have similarly sized edges, how skew they are. And actually, I did notice there are some fairly skew triangles or tetrahedron in there, but none of them are bad enough to like warrant a flag. So if I look over at the bottom, SimScale generally tries to give you an idea of whether this is an okay mesh or not. So it says the overall mesh quality is 0.28, and the acceptable range is anywhere between 0.035 and 1. So we are in the acceptable range for what it calls the mesh quality. And the mesh quality is like, it turns out that the thing that was the worst was the orthogonality of the elements, which is actually not a very important feature for the finite element method. So I'm not too worried about that. If you do find any bad features, you can use the mesh quality tool, but I'm not going to show that in this video. So let's create a run. So this is our course mesh. These are second order elements. And we'll run that. I'm going to pause the video and not show that. It'll take usually about a minute to run a simulation like that.